Hey guys, what's up? So coming at you here today from a very warm day in Beijing. There's been a lot of talk lately about the poor shape of the economy in China. And this whole economic downturn has been a little bit unexpected because people they assumed that after the COVID lockdowns were lifted, that the Chinese economy would just bounce right back up. And that's not what happened. Instead, there was a very small bounce for a few months. But then in the past 6-7 months, there's been a very steady decline downwards in the economy overall. So I guess you've seen the numbers already, record high youth unemployment, a crashing real estate sector, very low GDP growth overall, if any growth actually is happening right now in reality. But the question is why? Why are these things happening? In my opinion, there are three underlying long-term trends which are currently coming together and peaking right now at this very moment and causing this decline. The number one, or the first reason, is international trade and export. And here we see that Chinese exports actually were booming during COVID because a lot of people in the West stayed home and simply bought stuff online. So you had this huge peak in demand, and on top of that, because of supply chain constraints, a lot of companies overseas actually over-ordered to keep more inventory. And now, when consumption is dropping like a rock in the West because of inflation, higher energy costs, the Ukraine war, and the fact that people simply want to spend more money on experiences and services rather than products. This means that Chinese exports are crashing right now. So for example, the export volumes and value from China decreased by around 14.5% in July, which is a huge decrease. And even though there's a lot of talk about China gradually becoming more of a consumption-oriented economy, China is still by and large an export-driven economy. It's always been exports since the beginning of China opening up in the 1980s. That's been driving the economy. And then these excess profits from the exports have then been reinvested into things like real estate, which has driven the financial sector, consumption overall. So if exports fall off the cliff, it's having a huge impact on the overall economy and all of these export-driven areas in all around the country, basically. So that's the first reason. Number two is overall China's attractiveness as a business partner in the world. So after China began to open up in the early 1980s, China has basically had a red carpet for the whole world to come here to do business, to buy things from China, to open up factories in China, and also to sell their products to China. That red carpet has now been a little bit replaced by red tape, you could say. China's opening up has now started to become China's closing down. What really happened was that you could say that China was on this long path of opening up until about 2015-16, where policies gradually began to change. And then with Donald Trump in 2016, for the first time you had a major Western politician saying a lot of negative things about Chinese trade policy. He was saying that China was discriminating foreign companies. Basically, China was exporting their products to overseas, but not allowing foreign companies to sell their products to China on the same terms. Which is why you had this huge trade deficit between China and the rest of the world. And he was saying this very openly and loudly. And he was also criticizing China, for example, for that if foreign companies wanted to come here and to sell their products, they had to produce them locally in China with joint venture partners and then they had to give their technology and R&D to those local partners to be used as they pleased. And again, he was saying this out very loudly. In the beginning, nobody paid attention. They thought it was like another of his, let's say, xenophobic, outbursts. But then gradually he began to sway opinion, both in his own party, but also with Democrats. Hey, hello, hello. And then first he basically persuaded the US about this, and they began to change their policy. They began to try to negotiate about these trade deals. They put tariffs on Chinese products. And then he also turned Europe around. Europe, which had been until then very much pro-China, because China benefited countries like Germany, like France a lot, in many ways. But suddenly, the whole world, the whole West, began talking about unfair Chinese trade policies, and they wanted some improvement and change. Secondly, around this time, China also became a bit more defensive, especially in terms of its own foreign policy. So in the past, China had been quite careful, quite neutral in many ways. Suddenly, China became a little bit more aggressive on topics such as the South China Sea, and they began to use foreign policy as well, or use its trade as a tool to influence foreign policy. So for example, during COVID, Australia, some Australian politician made a statement that COVID probably came from Wuhan. And as a result, China stopped importing coal and wine and food from Australia, which had a huge impact on the Australian economy. And there was also a few similar situations with other countries in the world, like Lithuania, for example. So the world began to see that China was actually using its trade as a way to influence policy. China was no longer only an opportunity, it was also a potential threat. And a global competitor, rather than simply a place where you can go and make a lot of money. So that changed. And then you had COVID, of course, where the whole country locked down in a much more severe way than other countries around the world. It was working really well for some time, but then also you had extended lockdowns where supply chains were completely disrupted. Goods couldn't go in, couldn't go out. People couldn't go in, couldn't go out. And this kind of like tarnished China's reputation as a place that had stable policies which were business friendly. Suddenly, this idea that there was a lot of overreach from politicians into business took hold. And China was no longer seen as a safe or stable place to invest. And we see that, for example, now that companies like Apple are diversifying supply chains away from China to other countries. It's not only about trade policy. Of course, there's a trade policy element, that it's a way to avoid tariffs, for example, by producing elsewhere outside China. But it's also, I believe, in terms of stability. They want to have a stable place to invest where there's no like political disruptions anymore. So as a consequence of these policies, foreign direct investment, FDI, decreased by a whopping 87% in July, year on year. It's the lowest numbers since data began to be recorded in 1998. So FDI is falling off a cliff. The same time as exports is also falling off a cliff. Probably not a coincidence. But of course, FDI has always been very important for China. It's a way for China to develop, to modernize, to get new technology, knowledge, training, production methods, supply chain clusters, everything. So FDI today means a lot, but it also means a lot for the future. So FDI today would create jobs 5, 10, 20 years down the line, and that's now gone. That's a huge problem for China, both today but also in the long term. The third reason China's economy is going down right now is because everyone knew that one day China would become too expensive to produce shoes and cheap clothes and stuff like that. And sooner or later China would have to move up the production chain in terms of focusing more on technology, high value services, IT and so on. And that's what happened. China became a world leader in different internet platforms and IT services. They built huge companies like Tencent, Alibaba, JD, Meituan, Didi and so on. These companies had valuations similar to those of Alphabet, Microsoft and Apple, and they were driving huge amounts of investments to China, attracting talent and developing China to be a world-leading IT economy. And many of those successes were also exported to overseas, like TikTok, like Shine and Temu. That's all results of these huge IT platforms in China. But then again, as we all know, about 2 years ago, for whatever reason, there was a crackdown on IT platforms through regulatory measurements, penalties, anti-competition laws. So basically they were put in their place. And there was a clear message to the whole IT industry is that you have to be careful from now on. You have to watch what you're doing, fall in line, basically. So a lot of the investment and development in that sector in China has dried up. So that was supposed to be the next big thing for the economy. On top of that, of course, you also had the crackdown on things like the after-school education sector, which was basically wiped out also 2 years ago. Had around 10 million people working in it. Was driving a lot of the domestic Chinese consumption. Because keep in mind that Chinese consumers are still savers. They save around 50% of their income, which they mostly invest into their real estate, to their apartments. But to make Chinese people spend money is not easy. But they were spending money on their kids' education. That's like one thing that the Chinese families all want to invest money in. And now that option was taken away. The people working in that industry was mostly college graduates, young people who spoke English. So they now lost another source of potential employment, also driving up youth unemployment. I think those are the three main reasons. One is the international trade, export. It might be a bit more temporary, but it depends on the global economy. Depends on the Ukraine war, where in a way China is also somehow not fully as neutral as they like to be, would like to make themselves out to be. Secondly, it's long-term implications of China's different standing in the world, becoming a bit more antagonistic with the West. And third, it's about the way that policy right now is affecting private business, especially IT, and of course the after-school education sector. That's where we are. I believe that as China opened up from the 80s until the past 5-6 years ago, China's right now in a closing down phase. These changes are not accidental; they are intentional. A lot of Western analysts are asking themselves, okay, so when will the government launch a new package of reforms or, public policy that will help growth? To be honest, I don't think it's coming because the government has already changed the policy. They don't want to have this full-on Western market economy. They want something different where they can control the development a bit more. So that's just where we are going, I think. I think the days of an open China are basically over. China will try to find a balance between being what it wants to be and as well as to work with the world, because they still need the world. But it will just be in a more balanced way. So yeah, those are my thoughts. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to share. Looking forward to hear from you as always. Okay, take care guys, until next time.